Hey Burns, what's happening today?
Well, I'm doing okay. Is any of that lava flow from the Big Island reaching you?
No, but so
Is
far,
it Mauna Kea?
no, so far, Kilauea. So far,
Kilauea.
it's
Okay.
limited to the cauldron, and
Okay.
so we haven't had any breakouts, but that could happen. Another
Yeah.
700 homes get burned. That's
Yeah.
kind of the way it goes. Hey, I'm pissed off again. This 3.5 trillion uh, infrastructure bill slash whatever bill and whatever. What the hell is going on? I thought that you had a certain amount of money in your checkbook and you spent it. But to continue to raise the debt the way they are is ridiculous, number one. You know what I think they ought to do? They ought to sit down in committee, not that it's possible or even probable, but they ought to look at the whole damn budget and we ought to scratch everything that doesn't help the country in general. And if that means getting rid of Obama phones and everything else, that's the way to go. But to talk about erasing, student debt and all the rest of the stuff, that doesn't do anybody any, well, it doesn't do us any good.
Deck, I'll come back to the infrastructure bill. But your comment about the budget, and you and I have talked about it privately, zero-based budgeting, line item vetoes, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that the federal government and the House of Representatives go through this bullshit every year, wrangling over a budget that they never look at again. Once they pass a budget, regardless of what it is and which party led the fight, they go on their merry way and just spend. And there's not, it's not like private business where every month line managers have to report in and talk about variances to budget, whether it's revenue or costs, and break it down to the net's ass. I've spent a career doing that. I mean, this is government. You just spend. And then what they do is when they get into the fiscal fourth quarter for the federal government, then they try to spend any money they haven't spent in order to get the total amount spent in the fiscal year as high as they can, so that they can argue that they ought to be able to increase that by, say, 5%. So then they wrangle again over the 5%. It might end up being 7 or 10. And we as citizens go, that's crazy. But truth be known, they'll go much higher than that. I mean, basically, there are no budgets.
Well, what also bothers me is the debt has gotten so high. And if you ever want to have your mind blown, Google, national debt and how much it's costing in interest every year and whatever. I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg. That's the one thing that really bothers me. But the other thing that bothers me, there's so much crap in the budget that if you were to cut some of that out, the infrastructure bill and everything else would fall into place. Now, Eisenhower did it with the national highway system. We ought to be able to do that now, but for some reason we can't or won't.
Well, what you want is a business approach to government. Trump tried to do it, and I think successfully, despite his personal behaviors and shortcomings. And you saw it happen to him, 2 impeachments. I mean, just ruthless attacks on Trump and hoaxes and so forth, and the media peddling those things. But now we have serious crises that didn't exist even 9 months ago. And the media is in lockstep with the Democrats. The Democrats are in lockstep with the radical left. I mean, I don't even call the radical left Democrats necessarily. They vote for Democrats provided the Democrats whore for them. Other than that, they're just radicals, anarchists, crazies. Our government today, in my view, is no longer a representative government. The way the Constitution is set up is we vote for elected officials, and they're supposed to represent our views. And the Constitution and our traditions, our heritage, provide for protection of minorities, but you know, we're a democratic republic and we're supposed to be representative. And as Reagan oftentimes said, the government doesn't control us, we should control the government. Well, the only people controlling our federal government right now are anarchists, and they want to transform the country. And back to your comment about the infrastructure bill, there are two. One is the $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill that is, in my view, is going to be just another Obama shovel-ready bill. He called it the stimulus package, if you recall. And when all was said and done, most of that money went to corporate interests, particularly the banking industry, and people who funded Barack's campaigns. And there wasn't anything done with regard to the infrastructure in Obama's bill. Now we've upped the ante and it's $1.5 trillion, which you know, I think for most Americans, they couldn't begin to fathom what that means. And I'll guarantee you, we won't see new bridges, you know, new highway systems, anything akin to what Eisenhower did, as you just alluded to with the interstate highway system. I mean, so much of what we travel on in this country, if you know, you go back, things were built in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, you know, and now the specific bill you're alluding to, the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, the Democrats are dubbing the human infrastructure bill. Well, that's just their typical marketing bullshit. That's kind of like talking about the DACA program. You know, if you're an American child, you don't dream. But if you're from Mexico, Latin America, South America, you're a dreamer. Now, you may have been in the country long enough that you're in your 20s now, but you're still, the Democrats are talking about little tykes who have dreams of grandeur, and, you know, we should do things for them. It just never ends. And I'll guarantee you that 3.5 trillion, were it to pass, will be something larger than that. Many are saying more like 5 trillion, but I don't even think they know. And to your point, and it's an excellent point, once you dump that on top of the current federal debt, just the interest rates on that debt to service those, I mean, the American people can barely keep up with their own cost of livings under Biden. You know, the lockdowns, the COVID mandates have cost a lot of people their jobs, and then when the you know, COVID starts, the numbers start going down, then they up the unemployment rates. So restaurants and bars and hotels and so forth can't find service workers because they make more money sitting at home than they do working. And even if the minimum wage goes up to $15, they still make more sitting on their butts. So now we have a nation, Dick, where the American work ethic, which has been well regarded throughout the Western democracies, it isn't there anymore.
Well, part of the problem, and you touch on the minimum wage, is all it's going to do is get passed on to the consumer, which means it's going to be inflationary. And they'll be no better off when it was $12 an hour.
Couldn't agree more. We talked about that last week, and was that podcast 19?
Yes.
And when we were saying that, do Americans understand basic economics and that inflation is a tax? And right now, the inflation rate hasn't been this high, or spiked, I should say, maybe that's a better word, since the Carter years. And by the way, Carter was a Democrat, for those who don't remember. I don't even think most college students even know who Jimmy Carter was. Anyways, this back to this $3.5 trillion human infrastructure. That's just a euphemism for every single crazy item that radical liberals want to transform the country. And many of them want to bankrupt the country. I mean, that's all part of the Marxist agenda. Institutions you have to destroy before you can truly take them over. And I mean, Americans should be infuriated. They should be writing to their congressman, calling the White House hotline, raising holy hell.
Well,
And I don't have a sense, and maybe I'm wrong. Now I'm 74 years old and not in the workplace any longer, so I'm somewhat isolated, although I read a lot. But I don't get the sense that we're where we need to be to push back hard enough against what's going on. And one reason is, God, the average Joe can't figure out what $1 trillion is, let alone 1.5 trillion or 3.5 trillion or combined $5 trillion. And anybody who knows anything about what goes on in Washington is any number they ever give U.S. citizens, it's far exceeded. I mean, there's not a chance in hell they're going to keep to that. And what the $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill really is Bernie Sanders' agenda that he ran on for the presidency against Joe Biden.
Well, I think, and historically, it's been the way we operated until recently, and that is, you got to take care of the people first. The displaced coal miners, for example, in Appalachia. It's not their fault they ended up to where they ended up. So, maybe retraining programs, whatever. But all the money that could go to these people is going to service immigrants who are now being released into the country based on their word that they're going to show up for their embassy hearing. Well, history has shown that they don't show up. They just disappear.
Well, I have a feeling, and it's probably a reasonable feeling, that people watching the podcast and listening to anything I have to say presume that I'm a Republican a conservative Republican. And I'm anything but. You know this, Dick. I'm a conservative and I'm an independent voter. And I'm mad as hell at the Republican Party. It's just not the crazy Democrats. 49, a total of 49 Republicans in the House and the Senate this week passed a multi-million-dollar package requested by Joe Biden, the guy who drips ice cream cones all over his suits, and on most days doesn't have a schedule of anything to do. I mean, one of the toughest jobs historically in Washington is chief of staff, because you have to arrange access to the president and you have to keep a tight schedule. And the only thing they make sure about Joe Biden is that he's either in Delaware vacationing or he's resting at Camp David. But the Republicans, 49 of them, joined in this, and that money is earmarked for Afghans coming into the country. Now, I've already gone on record that if an Afghan worked in concert with the US military during our 20-year war over there, and now that the Taliban has taken over, we should provide protection. That could mean bringing them into our country. It could mean coordinating them going to another country, because we did have allies in the Afghan war. But even the media has reported that there's been no vetting of the thousands of Afghans who have come over, and with more to come. When's the last time, and I bet the answer is I haven't seen it, that you turned on the news and they interviewed an American who was saved and brought over after the military pulled out? You hear stories about Afghan people and the things they've had to go through, but we're not hearing from Americans. And that's because the Biden administration isn't interested in Americans. Certainly not American citizenship. And we both talked last week about how American citizenship has been totally devalued since we were both born back in, hard to believe, 1947.
But
I mean,
you
it
know,
used to be. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, but that's really an interesting observation. I never really thought about it. I have seen interview none of
Right.
Americans that were brought out. It's always been, oh, for example, and it was kind of heartwarming, the baby that was shown being pulled over the wall and then taken out. They interviewed the parents yesterday, today, I don't know, on the Today Show, and they were all very gracious and thankful. And they're going to name the baby with a middle name of Marine. And I thought that was kind of neat. But what does that have to do with the price of tea in China?
By the way, are you alluding to the baby that was pulled over the wall with the help of a U.S. Marine?
Yes,
Yeah, you know what's happened to the U.S. Marine?
no,
He's being indicted.
for what?
I don't know. I mean, is there something wrong with doing what he did? We already have one member of the armed forces, a Marine, who's now in the stockade because he dared to go on, I think he went on social media and asked why commanders were not being held accountable for the bungling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah.
So he's in the brig, but Miley's, before the for people who don't know who I'm talking about, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's before several congressional committees, and he's admitted that he did talk to the Chinese. He has now admitted before Congress that he did advise the Chinese that if Trump were to ever plan on attacking the Chinese or God forbid, use nuclear weapons, he would call and advise them. Before we go off on a discussion about Trump, because that didn't happen, wasn't contemplated, but that sounds treasonous to me, or at the very least, he had to go before a court martial. If he's exonerated based on military law, I think the military has a fairly good criminal justice system. F. Lee Bailey used to say that. So be it, but I think he should be court-martialed, or if he chose to resign. But it's the little guy who's getting nailed in this country for speaking up. It's just terrible.
Well,
I guess we're a little all over the board, but I'll just say this. Just as a 74-year-old retired citizen who knows a little bit about politics, it's kind of a passion with me. There's not a congressman, not even a bright mind like Ted Cruz, who could tell you everything in that phone book of a bill called the Human Infrastructure Bill. That's what they do. They get these staffs together, and the staffs cater and kowtow to the leftists, and they just pack the plan with everything under the sun. And so something may leak out, and Americans focus on it. But I'll guarantee you, most of us, including me, are clueless about what's in there. Now, one thing I know, they're going to guarantee 2 years of preschool. Now, I look back on my life. My wife worked, I worked. She worked and still had to go home and keep up a house and raise our boys. And I was busy trying to climb the corporate ladder, and we paid for daycare. And we had a wonderful woman, and we still, to this day, keep in touch with her and her family. But we didn't get subsidies, didn't ask for subsidies. I mean, we chose to have children. So in the America of old that I knew, if you had children, then you were responsible for them and raising them and providing for them.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up as we wander along. Is my wife went to work and her whole paycheck went to childcare, and we're talking back in the 70s, and it was like $400 a month. I realize it's quite a bit more, but literally her whole paycheck went to childcare.
Well, I've read a lot of history books, as have you, Dick. I've never seen a title called A Nation of Moochers, but I think somebody ought to write that book these days, because that's what we're becoming, whether by design, because people have their hands out and want to eat at the trough, or because the Democrats in Congress want to turn us into moochers. Well, one or the other is happening.
Yeah, but what surprises me, there are a couple of things. First of all, people still don't seem to understand that the government doesn't do squat, it's their money. Number one. Number two, they don't seem to realize, or maybe they haven't woken up to it, most of the, quote, common man in the United States doesn't even pay taxes at all.
That's right. 6 out of 10 adult Americans does not pay a dime in federal taxes. No skin in the game, yet if they choose to, they can vote. So we're paying taxes, but we're being overwhelmed by people who don't pay taxes making decisions for us, because 6 out of 10 who don't pay taxes is the majority. Now, think about that. That's pretty simple arithmetic to figure out what's gone wrong in this country. Every American citizen ought to have skin in the game, and non-citizens crossing the border should be deported. Better yet, don't let them cross. Now, think about this 1.5 infrastructure plan. It wasn't too long ago, Donald Trump asked for, and you correct me if I got the number wrong, but I think he has Congress for $500 million for a border wall. And of course, Nancy Pelosi put her foot down, said, and Chuck Schumer said, you're not going to get it. 500 million. So you can't have a border wall, which would have helped prevent the border crisis that's happening right now. But we can have a $1.5 billion infrastructure plan that's going to help Democratic congressmen in their pet projects, so they can point to a building that has their name on it and say, see what I did for my constituency. And like you say, that money can only come from one of two, well, actually it can come from three places. Either out of the taxpayer's pocket, or the government just prints it and there's no backing, they're just printing it. Or third, and I remember this well, as both Bushes did, Republicans, they borrowed heavily from China. So China had a lot of leverage over us because they had loan notes. So that's what goes on. Now, today I read a quote from a television interview with a Democratic congressman in Kentucky. And I couldn't believe it. Well, yeah, I could believe it. I could believe it. He said, I don't know what everyone's in a lather about 3.5 trillion. Whatever the government needs to spend, we can cover it. Now, when he says we, and I think this was your point earlier, he's saying the federal government can cover it. Well, bullshit. That's our money. The federal government isn't covering anything. I mean, part of this 3.5 trillion with a T infrastructure plan has provisions to start taxing Americans on mileage. I mean, just like you have a federal tax on every gallon of gasoline or diesel, you're also going to be taxed on how many miles you drive. In every way, shape, and form, they're taxing us to death, and we have no representation.
Oh, look, there's Tito.
Is he around?
Yeah, he's right behind you.
I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Yeah. Okay.
He's wandering around. Yeah, I just, maybe because they don't teach civics anymore, or history or anything else, maybe that's why people put up with this. I just find it unbelievable. I remember in Chicago, there was a lady that, after they nominated Barack Obama, she was all excited because she said she could stop paying her mortgage and she would get a free cell phone. And I'm going, what the hell?
Well, that's what they were led to believe. And then we know they got the Obama phones. They didn't get their mortgage covered, but
no, and she
a lot of those folks are on a federal subsistence that helps them pay a mortgage or a apartment rent.
Yeah, well, she was on TV several months ago saying she was lied to because her mortgage didn't get paid off. But she did admit that she got a cell phone.
Well, And don't believe for a minute this isn't part of the radical left's program of convincing people of color that there's such a thing as a racist-based white privilege. So we're still a majority in the country, although becoming less so, despite what you see with television commercials today. The majority are still whites. But the government has their hands in our pocket so deep, from the point of view of how the left thinks today, we don't have a right to remodel our homes, or younger couples wanting to move to a larger home because their family's growing, or God forbid, to buy a new car. I mean, that's all white privilege. What this country is all about are transfer payments.
Yeah.
One hand goes in Dick Griggs' pocket, and it comes out, and now it's going to go to an Afghan or a Haitian, or somebody from Venezuela. I mean, think about the irony of that. They're a bunch of damn Marxists trying to turn our country into a socialist country, and they're taxing our assets, our productivity over our careers, and giving it to Venezuelans who come north and cross the southern border. And the reason that Venezuelans are coming north to cross the southern border is they're poverty stricken now because their country became socialist. Now, it defies logic, but Dick, they don't teach civics, they don't teach history. I doubt today, do you hear a lot of college students speaking the King's English and sounding logical? I mean, most of what they say is convoluted and they can't finish a sentence. So do you think they're deep thinkers and think about, why did Cubans, the boat people, want to come to America? To escape communist control? Or people in Venezuela or any other country that's turned socialist, fascist? I mean, fascist, socialism, communism, eventually they all become one and the same. You have Nancy Pelosi living in a mansion in San Francisco with a wall around her home, but downtown San Francisco, you have to step over human excrement and hypodermic needles. I mean, that's emblematic of non-representative government, if ever there was one. And I saw a thing this past week. Shut me up when you want to interject. I'm on a roll, I guess. They talked to a guy who had lived. It was an interview of an individual who had lived in Brazil, and I'm not going to guess. It was one other country in South America, but there was a footnote to the article that those are the two countries in South America that are considered crime-ridden, poverty-stricken, etc. But this guy has recently been in Baltimore. And he said, my God, I'd feel safer back in those two countries than in downtown Baltimore. And I remember Trump, when he campaigned in 2016, he talked about that. How so many of our major metropolitan areas run by Democrats were hollowed out relics of what they were in their heyday. Poverty-stricken, crime-ridden, poor infrastructure. I mean, think about the Democrats. I'm sorry, they have a lot of balls. They want to tap us for $5 trillion to deal with infrastructure when they were the ones that let infrastructure go to hell. through poor government? I'll shut
Okay.
up.
We're gonna have to close, but I gotta close on something that you did because it was really kind of humorous, and that's white privilege. I was talking to one of my grandsons who is, quote, a person of color, I guess. And we were talking about the census. And I said, out of curiosity, with the choices you had, what did you put as your race, whatever, on the census thing? And he said, white. I said, well, why'd you do that? He said, well, I wanted a part of the white privilege. And I said, well, how has it worked out for you? And he said, nothing. And with that, let's go and wait until next week.
Okay, Dick. Good talking to you.
Okay.